Hello and welcome to this video on the Lekgolo, or wormy heavy machinery of the Covenant. If you have played any of the Halo games, you have heard the term Lekgolo or similar at some point, most likely. It's nearly always in reference to some form of heavy unit or vehicle, for example the scarab or hunters. These two things are very different, with hunters being a vaguely humanoid shape, massive armor, carrying a huge shield and firing a plasma cannon, while simultaneously having an oddly weak spot on their back. The Scarab is a giant, four-legged tank-type vehicle. It has a built-in power plant, that is its weakness, but also a giant cannon-like weapon. It also carries a small crew of grunts, jackals, and elites, with the latter being replaced by brutes in other games. What ties just these two examples together is the Lekgolo, or worms, that make up what is effectively the working parts of both in terms of movement and a degree of consciousness, if such a word can be applied in a relatively mindless killing machine. In terms of what the Lekgolo are, we can say they resemble a worm or eel. Each is individually about 1.4 meters or nearly 5 feet in length. While no specific diameter or width is given, they do weigh approximately 22.5 kilograms, which with a reasonably standard density of an organic being, that would be about 1.5 centimeters or 3/5 of an inch in diameter or width. The Lekgolo worm lives in what is roughly analogous to a colony that, once it reaches adequate size, does achieve some, let's call it, modicum of sentience. In terms of basic biology, we can say that they are lithivores, or more easily understood, they eat rocks and minerals. The Lekgolo bleeds a red-orange blood-like fluid, and these details alone are not really a great place to start from by comparison to other Covenant species, but it is enough to build up to a more complete explanation of the Lekgolo. Maybe, but it also might be as soon as Halo 6. We can start by looking at each member of the Lekgolo colony as an individual first. That is, each worm is theoretically fully functional as its own entity, albeit with a very limited cognitive function. The Lekgolo worm has its own nervous system too, a digestive system of sorts, and theoretically all the core requisites for reproduction. Whether this is sexual or asexual is not yet clear. Starting with the nervous system, we need to look at two aspects, let's say. Not the usual central nervous system and peripheral nervous system divisions, although that is a consideration. No, it is the internal and external nervous system. The Lekgolo worms are supposedly thought to be able to communicate in a very small range outside of their own body. The most easily explained part is the internal central nervous system. Let's compare the Lekgolo worm to a flatworm of sorts, a species humanity is very familiar with at this point in time, assuming that the Lekgolo has some of the same, or at least similar forms and functions. First, we have bilateral symmetry and cephalization. Flatworms are very simple creatures, and their entire nervous system is bilateral and symmetric, meaning that everything on the left is reflected on the right. Secondary to that is the cephalization. This is that just about all of their sensory and, let's say, useful neural structures are at the anterior front end of the flatworm. In terms of flatworm itself, it basically has a cerebral ganglia. That's a pair of nerve cell clusters, similar to the two hemispheres of your brain, at the front end or anterior end, and this serves as the primary control center. Now, if we operate on the premise that the Lekgolo worm has something similar, it kinda makes sense. They're not very wide, but they are very long. This would also be supported by the fact that, much like flatworms, they would therefore have two longitudinal nerve cords, one on the top side and one on the bottom side, and these would extend from that cerebral ganglia at the front end of the body and go all the way to the far end. Going across the body of it would be transverse nerves, and this effectively forms a ladder, allowing for communication very effectively along the length of the entirety of the Lekgolo worm. From these, there is a diverse network or net of nerves that spread out across the body, which connect to various sensory organs, the muscles that are required, and various other tissues. In terms of sensing ability, that is, ability to know what's going on in the outside world, there's a little more complexity here that we'll get to later when we talk about the colony, but for now, the flatworm itself, if we assume again this translates to the Lekgolo worm, have very simple sensory organs which connect almost directly into the central nervous system. But these include things like photoreceptors, so lights. Then you have the ability to see a certain amount of dark and light in a gradient, let's say, and this does allow them to an extent, navigate within the environment they're in. They have chemoreceptors, which allow them to see what's touching them or what's on their surface. So, for example, is it wet, is it dry, and similar. And then you have mechanoreceptors, which are basically a sense of touch. There is, at least in terms of flatworms as a whole, some degree of, let's call it, variation. But what we're going to look at specifically here is that there are certain kinds of free-living flatworms, such as planarians, as distinct from parasitic flatworms, that appear to be more developed. And given what we see with the Lekgolo worms, that is, they appear to be living relatively free in their environment, when they're not constrained inside of some sort of killing machine, they do fit more with a planarian or free-living flatworm species than they do with parasitic. This does bring us to control, however, both on an individual scale, and theoretically this would apply as the whole colony when they're doing something larger scale, for example as a hunter, a scarab, or something even bigger again. First of all, coordination and control. That cerebral ganglia, that thing at the front of the flatworm, would theoretically provide the ability both for sensory input and coordinating responses to the environment. On an individual scale, this isn't all that much, remembering that they're very small, very simple, and even when scaled up to the size of a Lekgolo worm, it's still not a lot. 1.5 centimeters is very tiny. It's essentially somewhere smaller than if you had 2 of your fingers side by side. The longitudinal nerve cords provide all the necessary communication along the entire length of the body, and theoretically allow for both the reception and broadcasting of any communication required, both within the flatworm and, as we'll get to later on, outside the flatworm, and therefore theoretically a Lekgolo worm. And finally, we have the ladder-like structuring. Because it is ladder-like, it allows for very rapid communication between the two sides of the body, and it also ensures that both sides of it have coordination. This is very important, as we'll see later on. And finally, we have processing. Unlike the human body, for example, there is relatively limited processing capacity. The nerve clusters that are there to act as a sort of a makeshift brain aren't really all that substantial. But theoretically, and this is a very, very speculative statement, if you have enough of these flatworm species acting in a similar way, and we apply this to the Lekgolo worms, theoretically, if each of them specializes to some extent, or at least internally, some of them specialize and the external ones are purely dedicated to being muscles, you could see them essentially acting as a weirdly distributed brain. Similar to, say, how you can have multiple CPUs working together to produce a greater result than the individual components are capable of, if they each specialize. This would be more consistent if, much like, say, planarians or free-living flatworms, were a good example of what's going on, because they can exhibit basic learning and memory behaviors. That is, they can learn to figure out an association between two distinct things, like, for example, here is some light, that means there must be food nearby, and they can retain this information. If that is the case, it would be something we could extrapolate out to the Lekgolo worms, and therefore, theoretically, that would explain how they can function as much as they do. And this would be more important since flatworms have demonstrated a degree of, let's call it, neuroplasticity, despite how limited and, frankly, somewhat retarded the flatworms are by comparison to their seemingly far greater capacity, or let's say ability, as a Lekgolo worm. Of course, this may simply be a matter of scale. Simply having a larger brain region allows for much greater functionality, although that does also come with the caveat that typically the larger an organism is, the more of the brain is needed to be associated with controlling that organism's activities. Basic activities like breathing, digestion, moving, things like that, rather than greater cognitive function. Next, we have the question of metabolism. Everything that lives needs to eat and drink at some point. This also nearly always invariably ends with pooping or some other form of defecation. Now, this is also a lesson for children, but it's true of just biology in general. Lekgolo are lithivores. Lithivores effectively don't exist, but theoretically, they eat minerals. Minerals, at least in terms of human biology, are defined not as a source of energy, though, and certainly just about any other creature on Earth. In fact, every creature on Earth that we know of is not a lithivore, And this is a challenge as, well, to the best of human knowledge, they don't exist anywhere and we need to play the theory crafting game. Oh wait now, that's been copyrighted, we think. We need to speculate wildly, just like anti-vaxxers. So, operating very much on the wild speculation side of things, there are some, let's call it, ways this can happen. It's just going to be very hard to test them. First, we have actually getting energy. So, for example, with every other living organism, you have ATP. ATP is what's basically called the currency of the cell, but ignoring that for now. We have chemolithotrophy. That is taking inorganic compounds and using them to produce energy. For example, oxidation. Lithivores could use chemolithic processes. Bacteria do this, but on a much smaller scale, to get energy out of certain minerals, sulfur, iron, and even hydrogen to some extent. What it requires is that, for example, you oxidize elemental sulfur, and this yields a sulfate. What you get from this is 4.67 calories per gram, and oxygen, when used with iron, can do something similar. You get ATP. The second possibility, and this is perhaps more likely, although not necessarily so given the environment in which the Lekgolo worms were found, is symbiotic bacteria. There are currently no, let's say, known bacteria that can directly metabolize minerals for energy in and of itself entirely all the time. There are, however, let's call them symbiotic bacteria, called limotrophic bacteria, that are seen in giant tube worms, and these bacteria can oxidize certain minerals, hydrogen sulfides particularly, but it's important to remember that they typically live near hydrothermal vents. These are underwater environments that are surprisingly hot and very active in terms of minerals and other things. This produces organic carbon, and that's then used for energy by the host. Theoretically, a lithivore could have a specialized organ, or organelle, in which some sort of, let's say, symbiotic species lives, and that converts the minerals into energy. Maybe. If this were the case, and this is the big problem here, you have to consider the environment. The original discovery of the Lekgolo worms is in an environment that is very much incompatible with most, if not all, normal organic life. And as such, you would need to find them in not just an environment rich in minerals. Volcanic regions are perhaps the best example of this, although again thermal vents are another, but you'd also need them to be in an area where they have relatively ready access to things like sulfur and iron, if not other metals again. And the last, let's say, easily explainable option is carbon biosynthesis. That is, you take raw minerals, for example limestone, calcium carbonate, or various metallic ores, and you use these as the material to build up the organism, but this is less likely, and it's less likely for a very good reason. Most of what we see with Lekgolo worms is that, well, they look very much organic, they behave very much organic. That is, they appear to be squishy and soft and not very metallic at all. Now, this could be wrong entirely, but it's seemingly not consistent with what is described. We do have a theoretical, well, far more theoretical, let's say, and that is synthesis, synthesizing of organic compounds from the available minerals and similar. If the lithivore relies entirely on a symbiotic bacterial species, that species could be synthesizing the organic molecules, which would allow us to take a step back and say that although the outside doesn't look right for a lithivore, maybe the bacteria are making up what's needed. For example, saccharides, amino acids, and similar. This could be done by taking CO2 from the air and the various trace minerals and organics within the lithivore's consumption, and using these to make up the various tissues. This would be more likely in a relatively, let's call it, shellfish-type creature, because a lot of the unneeded materials in the form of, say, metals, minerals, and so on, would get incorporated into the shell, and the required organic material would be more useful in, well, making various organic components. The physical processing is a little more difficult again, And this is because breaking down what is needed is going to be very hard. Worms are very good in very soft soil because they can burrow their way through. A worm cannot burrow through rock. Now, we would argue that the size of the Lekgolo worm actually makes this even harder again, because the bigger something is, the more difficult a time they have passing through soil. So, this is even less likely, unless they can, let's say, develop some sort of teeth that can literally grind down the surface, or some sort of organ that can do the same for things that they've consumed. The sea urchins and chitinous creatures do, to an extent, have this, although slightly more complicated. And let's say chickens, birds in general, have something similar. It's a gizzard-like structure that they have large rocks in their gullet, their neck, and this helps to break down larger objects into much smaller things for their consumption. It is possible that through chemical digestion, essentially how they make McDonald's soft serve and, well, McDonald's food in general, they can break down larger things, typically minerals here, and turn them into something digestible as a sort of slop. Again, McDonald's-based food. Or, if they're not using enzymes, acids would also do it for some minerals and metals, although not all. And finally, specific dietary requirements. Now, if you look at all of the different minerals that are out there in various environments, there's a, let's call it, great deal of variation in the kind of mineral deposits that are out there. If you just look at a range of rocks, just random rocks you can pick up on the side of the road, as you walk along, say, a kilometre, or probably a couple of kilometres, or an equivalent distance being roughly a mile, you would find that you actually find a fairly wide variety of them. Now, exactly what you find will depend on where you are in the world, but the fact is that in order to break them down, enzymatically or with acid, you would need very different approaches. And this gets even more complicated with things like, say, diamonds or even gold. So you need both mechanical strength and certainly chemical strength, whether it's enzymes, acids, or something else, to break down these very complex things into something far more usable. And finally, we have the metabolism. This throws back to the earlier point of how do you generate energy. Now, there are species on Earth that, to a certain extent, can produce very small amounts of energy using minerals. Corals are an example, but this is very small and very inefficient by comparison to organic compounds. So it seems more like a emergency backup than a primary mechanism. We've mentioned the environmental requirements, and this does raise some pretty serious questions about how the Covenant keep the Lekgolo worms alive. And mostly, where do they store them when they're not being used as killing machines, or how do they grow them up to a size to then get a colony into a killing machine, let alone individual members of the colony? So you would need somewhere that is not oxygen-rich at all, because the more oxygen there is, the more metals will be oxidized by the oxygen in the atmosphere. Then you have areas that are going to have to be geologically active, or at least makeshift replacements for geologically active areas, if you're not providing things like sulfur and iron directly. We would recommend that out of all of these, some sort of symbiosis is the most likely explanation, but it has some serious limitations in how effective it would be based on where it is and what it requires in the wider environment that we've seen the Lekgolo worms originating from in the Taming of the Lekgolo. With the metabolism question somewhat vaguely possibly addressed, we can now talk about how the Lekgolo worm can move and act, or maybe not. A lithivore might resemble something, let's say, a chitinous or a more humanoid-like mollusk. That is a hard exoskeleton or endoskeleton made from various minerals. Mostly those minerals are calcium or carbonate, and even silica in some cases. These are going to be synthesized from the various materials that are being consumed and metabolized. Since we obviously don't see any hard exoskeleton, or even to a certain extent an endoskeleton, probably not the case. Theoretically, a lithivore may have multiple legs, but again, we don't see this. So basically, most of the generally accepted ways for large lithotrophic aliens to exist just aren't feasible. This does bring us to how mollusks on Earth, that is, for all intents and purposes, clams and similar shellfish, behave on Earth and get around, as these might provide us with, if not an outright, at least a vague indication of how it is the Lekgolo worm can do what it does. So first of all, we have the foot. The foot is basically a giant flat muscle, which you find on the bottom side of muscles that allow them to move. This is done via the muscles contracting in a sort of wave action, and this allows the foot to push the mollusk forward, but essentially only forward. There's also gliding, which is done by gastropods, snails, slugs and similar, which probably not as relevant necessarily, but may be useful as a adjunct to other mechanisms. What they do is they create a slippery surface that, well, rather obviously reduces friction, and that aids movement over rough or dry surfaces. This also helps to a certain extent to protect the soft tissue. The downside to the mucus approach, that is gliding, is that it is relatively energy inefficient. That is, it costs a lot to do. Then we have other similar sorts of approaches that use the foot, but slightly different again. Rather than trying to rely on the foot sort of as a snaking motion, some bivalves, like clams, use their foot and burrow it into the sediment underneath them, and this allows them to a certain extent anchor to that point, and then that muscle will contract and pull the body of the clam or similar forward, or downwards, or whatever it is that's required. Much like the human penis, this is, let's say, extended using blood pressure. The burrowing in like this is particularly useful when we're talking about soft substrates like sand, mud and similar. Not so much necessarily in a hard environment, but assuming that we're talking about the, let's say, a hunter as a whole colony, theoretically, with hard anchor points like, say, the armor, or other Lekgolo worms, the ability to anchor and then draw into one point might allow for that to happen. This is possibly, theoretically, more supported by the idea of, say, limpets. These are another gastropod that use a suction-like activity on their foot, and this allows them to cling tightly to rocks and other similar areas to resist changes in tide, waves, and similar. It does let them also move a relatively short distance, but they use their foot in that respect, so it's described somewhat as hopping. And by twisting the foot, they can, well, jump for a brief time. And finally, we have octopuses, because everything comes back to octopuses when you talk about tentacly things, because creepy. Octopuses primarily use their flexible arms and suckers for grip and to be able to hold on to the environment. Much the same way the mussels would contract their leg or foot in this case, the octopus can also contract their arm, and this allows them to push or pull. We would argue that simply by following a vaguely similar structure to the human anatomy, that is, having a hard anchor point and muscles that can contract against this, you can pull the various aspects of the Lekgolo body, whether it's in the form of a scarab, a hunter, or anything else, in the right ways. Last, we have a basic physiology and anatomy of an individual Lekgolo worm. In this case, we can focus on some core organs not already broadly covered, such as the cardiac system, respiratory, and blood, or a similar analogue. Much of what we've been speculating so far has relied heavily on both very specific and very basic chemical reactions for energy, but very complex physiological processes and actions not so much. This is where and how the Lekgolo bodily functions and physiology gets rather difficult. First, we have digestive system structure. Again, we use the flatworm as an example simply because they are the closest analog we can find, but flatworms have a relatively incomplete digestive system. They basically have a bag. It's not quite a bag, it's a long tube, but what happens is that everything goes in the single open end. That's its mouth, and it's also where it expels waste from. This is a muscular pharynx, essentially a sphincter like your butthole, but obviously slightly different again. What's inside this is a branched gastric cavity, vaguely resembling your intestines, except that, well, it's forked many, many times. With the, let's say, long spreading and tenderly like intestines, the content is pushed down through the intestines via a muscular system with both longitudinal, circular, and diagonal fibers. are very much similar to the human intestinal tract, and this helps both in pushing the food all the way down to the end and getting it back out the front end. Similar to what South Park shows, but rather different again. The muscles are controlled by the central nervous system, and because of this, there's one big caveat to everything we've described. It's that the muscles involved in this are primarily found in the body wall and around the pharynx, not so much around the intestine itself, which is drastically different to the human body. This brings us to the muscle contraction. Unlike human, and for that matter most other large organisms, flatworms, again using them as an example, rely heavily on something like cilia. Cilia are tiny little finger-like projections on the ventral, or essentially the belly-facing surface, and these, along with the larger scale muscle contractions, allow for the movement of the flatworm. And theoretically, if you have the flatworm, for example, tensioning or torsioning, that is to twist, it would shorten, and this would somewhat similarly recreate the effect of shortening a muscle in, say, a much larger organism like a human or an elephant even. And this would allow for the, let's say, simulacrum of a muscle contraction in the Lekgolo worm. If you have the cilia also acting as a way of, say, ensuring adhesion or controlled contraction across all of the Lekgolo worms, this would theoretically allow for much better, let's say, homogeneous or simultaneous contraction. Of course, we also have the fact that the same muscles are used to both, extend the flatworm to suck in food and, to a certain extent, expel it. Now we need to talk about the reproduction, because everything comes back to sex, even in the case of weird organic but not organic creatures. Most flatworms are going to be hermaphroditic, although some can reproduce asexually. Being hermaphroditic, they have both male and female reproductive organs, just like, say, a snail. Male organs are the standard. They have a testy, they have sperm, and they have some sort of ducts that are going to send it out into the phalanx or penis-like object. The females produce ovaries, the ovaries then make eggs, and these are connected to oviducts, and then that comes to some sort of a seminal receptacle, and in some instances even a uterus or uterus-like structure. In free-living flatworms, some of them can just simply reproduce asexually, and we suspect this is more likely, and that's done by fission, in which the flatworm splits into two, and these two parts then regenerate as a whole. We say this only because the colony does something similar. When they reach adequate size, the colony will simply split into two equal colony-like offspring. Unlike fandoms that will do the same thing, there's not a lot of infighting involved, thankfully. And then we have the skin or integumentary system, the body covering. Now, the epidermis of flatworms is again probably a good example, but not perfect, mostly because we would argue that it's not really used for locomotion as much. And so, at least in terms of flatworms, they sort of have a top side which is cilia-free, and a bottom side that appears to be ciliated. In terms of circulatory systems and respiratory systems, we don't necessarily need them. This probably doesn't seem quite right at first, but hear us out. The flatworm doesn't have a heart, or blood vessels, or really anything else. This is going to be a slight problem with terms of Lekgolo given their size. The small size of the flatworm allows for diffusion to basically compensate for all of the issues here. So, theoretically, you can get whatever you need from one end of the flatworm to the other relatively easily. Or more accurately, it's going to allow for the movement of high concentration to low concentration. The other thing with the flatworm is that their gastrointestinal gastrovascular cavity is, dual purpose. It allows for the distribution of nutrients, but also it allows for the absence of a circulatory system to be compensated for. Similarly with the respiratory system, that same void, let's call it, allows for most of what needs to be done that way, but also, to a certain extent, due to their size, they can actually obtain a fair amount of oxygen and expel carbon dioxide via their skin, or at least body surface. This is one reason why they are flat in the terms of flatworms, although we're not quite sure about whether or not Lekgolo are flat or just very much, let's say, tubular. If the Lekgolo worm uses the same sort of specialized structures that flatworms do, it's possible that they could still maintain the same method, assuming of course that they rely entirely on oxygen to survive, which, well, they'd certainly need to, certainly for oxidation. Well, not necessarily, but let's assume that that's what they're using for now. You would need to have those specialized structures allow for the oxygen to pass into the depths of the Lekgolo worm, and theoretically, hopefully, reversible to allow for CO2 to be expelled out again. This would also drastically reduce the need for blood itself, or at least a blood in the terms of human-type blood. It doesn't mean that they necessarily have, let's say, no blood-like compounds. They may have something similar to, say, hemoglobin, but based on, say, copper, which would be a hemocyanin, and these would theoretically explain why their blood is orangey red, and also why they don't necessarily need to worry as much about oxygen transportation, although, again, somewhat speculative that given the lack of specific movement from one area to another. Knowing the singular Lekgolo worm details is only half of the equation so far. We now need to look at the colony, which is how when Lekgolo become, if not fully functional, is certainly more useful to the Covenant. A single Lekgolo is creepy and uncomfortable, but a colony of Lekgolo is a threat when a hunter, and a terrifying prospect when in something like a scarab. But if you run the simulations, you know they can be beaten. We can start with communication. As much like any good relationship, communication is key. Much like a successful relationship, it also involves a lot of just doing what you are told to keep the peace, and in this case, due to a lack of more advanced cognitive function, not questioning. We can work from the supposed theory that Lekgolo worms can communicate with their nervous system beyond their own body. Given the theoretical basic organism the Lekgolo worm is, we can speculatively say that they use a sort of localized voltage change, the same basic idea as with human neurons. The process of passing an action potential along the axon will lead to a change in polarity both inside and outside of the neuron axon. That charge, if it was detectable by the neighboring Lekgolo worms at its front end, as with flatworms, could explain how we see a sort of staggered colony of Lekgolo worms able to act in a reasonably coordinated manner. The muscle actions would be reasonably simultaneous as it ripples across the layers of Lekgolo worms, and it should theoretically, if they all start at the top end, travel all the way down to the bottom end, and then the next Lekgolo worm would be, let's say, instructed to move. And because much like, let's say, the human heart, for example, it contracts in a rippling motion down, admittedly very fast, but in a sort of motion down, you can see how this is feasible. This would mean the individual Lekgolo worms have become somewhat intertwined, as the neurons of one Lekgolo worm become practically, if not symbiotic, directly tied into another Lekgolo worm. This would also be more likely if the conjoined Lekgolo worms share transport proteins to send both chemical and other signals between each other, and all quickly share common needs such as minerals and so on. This could be accentuated or amplified by chemical signaling too, both accentuating the role of chemicals in communication, but also somewhat explaining the large-scale death of the Lekgolo colony after sufficient loss of colony members, typically due to angry green men beating them bloody. This is somewhat supported by the way in which large forms known as the Lekgolo in a colony can sense things out to 1,000 meters. This is partially driven by the way the collective Lekgolo colony acts as a giant antennae, and partly by the greater processing capacity of the collective colony. Essentially, you have a huge form, and all of these neurons providing what is almost close to a mesh network on the outside and inside, and catching signals, or possibly broadcasting signals on a larger scale. Because of this, they're therefore able to pick up what's going on, even if it is very small. This also brings up communication, a feat not possible for a singular Lekgolo worm, but possible for a colony of adequate size. They can, to a certain extent, buzz or vibrate to produce various sounds. Now, the human vocal cord, for instance, passes air through to do this, but theoretically, if you have something like a speaker is essentially beating on the air to produce the sounds you want to hear, and theoretical again, the Lekgolo could do something very similar. They're just not quite capable of processing well enough to make individual words, but certainly various sounds. Being a collective also comes with certain costs too. This is true in communism and in weird, creepy space worm colonies. If too many of the colony members die, the whole colony dies, just like communism and public radio. The mechanism behind the fatality is somewhat interesting from a details perspective, but from a, let's say, very broad perspective, rather predictable. If the Lekgolo colony members are forcefully removed from the rest of the colony, the removed members will shrivel up and die, and it appears that their central nervous system is entirely linked, and this is one reason why they die. This could also be linked with a release of a large amount of toxic compounds, or perhaps we should say associated with. This happens in most living organisms. Even human tissue does this. So if you're wounded, for instance, in any way, the cells that are destroyed will release various chemokines and similar. These compounds tell the local cells nearby that damage has happened. If enough of these chemokines are released, the cells nearby take that as an instruction to die too. This is a process of apoptosis. The reason for that is straightforward enough. It creates an area that quarantines the damage. It prevents other tissues from being killed off as the damage spreads out. The further away from the injury, the less of the signal that is there, and therefore, rather than apoptosis, those cells take it as a signal to increase cell division and heal by replacing the lost tissue and cells. In the case of the Lekgolo colony, the same thing may happen, but a whole member of the colony has died, not a part of an organism. Theoretically though, if we treat it as a sort of analogue, if enough of the Lekgolo worms, in this case an analogue to individual cells in the colony, die, or are blown up with grenades, bludgeoned with armoured fists, or shot full of lead, then the threshold for whole colony toxicity level could be achieved. Essentially, that signal is amplified so drastically that rather than just being a localized quarantine, the entire organism just goes, oh, well, we're buggered, time to die. There is one aspect to the Lekgolo that we've struggled to answer, and we've mentioned this in passing. They appear to be protein-based. That is, if you look at the Lekgolo worm on a colony or individual scale, they do appear to be made out of some sort of organic substance, a protein probably. At no point so far have we been able to figure out how to make the protein from a lithivore or synthesize it in this context. There are some ways they might be able to do it, but we can't see that as sustainable, and certainly not at a large scale. Now, at a very large scale, we're talking planet size here, we can see getting protein on a primordial Earth, but the scale and conditions for the Lekgolo worm just aren't compatible with that idea. It isn't feasible. On a primordial Earth, you had things like plasma, primordial soup, and enough random chemicals and elements that you could just start generating these. You just don't have, well, at least plasma, inside of Lekgolo worms, at least not that we're aware of. And as a result, it's unlikely to be the case that they're working the same way in terms of generating proteins and other similar things. But overall, this is how you can get a living, somewhat theoretically breathing, eating, and theoretically pooping Lekgolo worm in all its shapes and forms, followed by a terrifying, creeping colony, and then ultimately huge weapons and angry pairs of them. Probably some sort of a domestic spat going on between them. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, do post them below.